I have crossed the same dust-covered roads for generations, unseen but never absent. I am not the breath of man, but the breath that moves when man has ceased to speak. I am the wind, shaped by silence, by waiting, by the long ache between prophecy and fulfillment. Long ago, I wrapped myself around the robes of prophets, curled through the spaces between their words and the heavens. I remember how their voices once shook the air like thunder. I remember the way the people listened. I remember being welcomed not as a gust to shut the window against, but as a companion of the divine. Back then, when the air trembled with promises, when the skies themselves seemed thinner, closer, more open, I carried the scent of certainty. But that time is no more. Now I pass over fields and rooftops and marketplaces, and no one notices me. I whistle through olive trees and no one lifts their head. I trace my fingers along the stone walls of synagogues, and they do not tremble. The children play, the elders sigh, and the earth grows old under the weight of its own waiting. I wonder, has everyone forgotten? Or have they simply grown tired of remembering? Once, the people were kindled by hope. Even their despair was laced with fire. They cried out beneath the stars, asking when will he come? When will the promise walk among us? When will the Redeemer arrive, born not from strength but from mercy? But their cries have dimmed. I have carried them across valleys, over mountains, into the dark corners of memory, and they have grown faint. Still, I carry them. I do not forget. There are moments, rare and precious, when I find myself passing through a home where an old woman still hums the songs of David under her breath, or a father kneels alone in a room too small for dreams and whispers a prayer not because he expects an answer, but because silence is too heavy to bear alone. I move through those moments gently. I linger there longer. These are the fragments I collect, the sounds no one else hears, the longing no one else honors. I tuck them away beneath my wings, and I keep them moving, circling, like embers that refuse to die. I have seen the ruins of temples where holy words were once shouted into the sky. Now the stones crumble, and ivy grows where fire once danced. I slip through the cracks of old scrolls, forgotten in corners, their ink faded but their message intact. The word remains, even when no one reads it. The covenant echoes, even when no one speaks it aloud. The silence, for all its weight, cannot erase what has been spoken into being. It only buries it for a time. Sometimes, I wonder if I am the only one who remembers the voice. That terrible, beautiful voice that split the heavens and called nations to repentance. It used to shake the very air I traveled through. Now, I search for it, aching for a tremor, a single note, anything that might signal its return. I rush through valleys hoping to be pierced again, hoping to be filled again. But the sky holds its breath, and so do I. And yet I remain. I remain not because I must, but because something in me believes. The kind of belief that has no words, only movement. The kind of belief that is not loud or demanding, but faithful in its drifting. I have no voice of my own, but if I did, I would tell them. The silence does not mean he is gone. The stillness does not mean he has forgotten. Sometimes, silence is the sign of something being born, something that must first take root in the dark. I have brushed past the lips of those who still recite the Shema with cracked voices. I have gathered the tears of those who light candles not in certainty, but in defiance of despair. I have flown through nights so cold they seem endless, and still I return with the dawn, searching, waiting, listening, because I know what it feels like to hold on to a promise that shows no sign of being kept. I know what it means to keep believing in something you have never seen. Once, I carried the cries of Israel across the wilderness. Now I carry their silence. But silence can be sacred too. It can be the soil from which redemption rises. I do not understand the ways of the Holy One, but I have felt his breath. And though I have not felt it in centuries, I believe he will speak again, perhaps not in thunder, perhaps not through prophets, but through something smaller, something quieter, a whisper in the dark, a heartbeat in a womb, a yes in the night. I feel it coming. I do not know when. I do not know how. But the air has begun to change, and when you live as long as I have, you learn to trust that change. You learn to follow it. you learn that even the longest silence cannot last forever. I slipped through the broken archways of the old temple, where ivy now climbs like questions up the sun-bleached stone and dust gathers in corners, no longer swept by reverence. And as I moved through those long-forgotten halls, I felt something faint but persistent still clinging to the air, as though the words once spoken in fire had not entirely left but hovered just beyond the silence, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be breathed again. The pillars, once majestic and wrapped in incense and chant, now lean with weariness, their carvings faded, their symbols softened by time and wind. And yet when I brushed across them, I heard the echo of voices that once thundered with certainty, proclaiming a future not yet born, voices of men anointed by a call greater than themselves, their lungs filled not with air but with command, their mouths unable to stay closed even when death circled near. Isaiah had stood here once, or in a place like this, his lips still tinged with coal, his eyes full of visions too vast for sleep. And as I passed over this place, I remembered the weight of his voice cutting through me, the way his words held shape and direction, and trembled not with fear but with glory. I do not forget such voices, not because they are loud, but because they live longer than the walls that tried to contain them. Even now, when I drift through the stillness, I can hear them faint, like a memory buried in the skin, like a name almost spoken, like the rhythm of a song whose tune the heart remembers even when the lips have long forgotten the words. The people once gathered here, hundreds at a time, their feet packed into the stone floor, their hands raised in lament or joy or hunger for justice, and I would dance among them, not as interruption but as thread, as spirit, as the breath between syllables that gave life to the word. And I could feel the longing thick in the air, feel it in the salt of their sweat, in the quiver of their throats, in the silence that always followed the final note of prayer. Now there is no song, now only dust. But the dust remembers. The dust has a memory deeper than the bones buried beneath it, and when I stir it, I feel the old rhythm, the remnants of clapping hands, the vibrations of feet that stomp the ground in faith, even when that faith was tested by exile, silence, and shattered altars. I moved past the sanctuary and into what once was the chamber of scrolls, now a hushed tomb of curling parchment and faint ink, and even here I heard the whispers, the brittle turning of pages that once proclaimed fire and mercy, judgment and redemption, and I paused, not because I was tired but because the space demanded it, because something sacred still pulsed beneath the surface of decay. There, beneath layers of time, the words slept not dead, not forgotten, but waiting like a seed beneath winter, like a heartbeat under cloth. And I hovered there, the way one might hover near an ember, careful not to disturb, but hoping it still carries warmth. There were names written here, etched in fragile ink names of prophets, kings, tribes. Wanderer sand, I read them as I moved, not with eyes but with memory, not with understanding but with ache. These names were not dust to me, they were stories, and I have carried them for generations, not because I was asked to, but because I could not bear to let them disappear. I am not the voice of God, but I have known its echo. I am not the keeper of promises, but I have traced their path through every broken gate and dried up well and shattered rooftop. I am not the answer, but I am the breath that carries the question. And in this temple, even ruined as it is, even stripped of its gold and emptied of its priests, the question still lingers. When, O Lord, when will the promise come to pass? When will the child arrive? When will the silence be broken? I cannot speak the answer, but I know this much: the question still has power. It still stirs the air. It still moves me to weep through corridors no longer walked, to brush against walls no longer prayed against, to curl around the broken stones and remind them they were once part of something holy. The people may have stopped coming. The songs may have gone quiet, but the temple remembers, the wind remembers, and somewhere, beyond what is seen, so does God. I moved beyond the temple ruins, drifting across the hills where shepherds rarely linger and children no longer chase the sun. And there, in the folds of forgotten villages, I began to notice something softer than silence, something humbler than Hopia kind of faith, not sung or shouted, but breathed quietly in corners, lived gently by those whose backs were bent not only by age but by the long weight of waiting. These were not prophets, not priests, not scholars with scrolls or rulers with swords, but ordinary men and women whose names are never written in records, whose hands are worn from grinding grain and wiping tears, whose days begin in labor and end in prayer, though no one hears the words except perhaps the very one they believe has stopped speaking. I pass through their homes at dawn, brushing the edge of their shawls as they rise before light touches the rooftops, watching as they kneel beside sleeping children or sit beside fires gone low, their lips moving with words older than their wrinkles, words passed from mother to daughter, father to son, not as law but as lifeline. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone, they whisper, not as triumph but as truth. A truth held onto, not because it answers every pain, but because it has survived every pain. I circle around these prayers, letting them cling to me like morning mist, carrying them from one cottage to another, from one sigh to the next, as if to remind the sky that it is still being spoken to. These elders, with their cracked voices and tired bones, do not pray for themselves anymore. Their bodies have long accepted the slow unraveling of time, but their hearts still reach forward, still stretch toward a promise they may never see fulfilled. They do not speak of Messiah with the fire of warriors or the logic of scribes, but with the ache of those who have lived through droughts, buried children, and held on to psalms like lifelines thrown into stormy seas. I have seen one woman light a lamp each night and set it near her window, not because she expects a guest, but because her mother did the same, and her grandmother before her, and somewhere in that small flicker of flame, a tradition refuses to go out. I have heard an old man, nearly blind, recite the words of Isaiah by memory, stumbling only once, and then pausing not in shame but in reverence, as if giving space for the silence to speak too. These are not the voices that shake cities or draw crowds, but they stir me in a way thunder never could, because there is something deeper than sound in these lives, something quieter than prophecy, something steadier than visiona, resilience that refuses to be named as doubt simply because it does not shout. I linger in these places longer than others, not because they are holy by appearance, but because they hold something sacred in their persistence. I have watched a woman kiss the mezuzah on her door with a hand that trembled more from memory than from frailty. I have felt a man's breath hitch when he speaks the name of the Lord, not out of fear, but out of longing too deep for language. These are not the ones history will remember, but I do, because I have walked with them through every winter, through every famine, through every unanswered prayer, and I have never once heard them curse the silence. They do not demand signs. They do not threaten abandonment. They simply continue rising, kneeling, singing when no one listens, believing when no one affirms. And though they do not know it, I carry their prayers higher than any trumpet, across valleys and over ridges, letting them rise where incense no longer burns, letting them whisper into the ears of angels who, perhaps, still wait too. The silence may be heavy, but it is not unbroken. The waiting may be long, but it is not empty. And I, who have flown for centuries without rest, find myself humbled by these ones who do not fly at all, who remain, who stay, who trust not in answers but in the presence of a question still worth asking. They teach me, without knowing, that hope does not always roar it, sometimes simply breathes, again and again, until the heavens are full. I drifted far from the hills and homes, farther than most dare to travel, into the barren lands where silence was not born of reverence but of ruin, where the ground bore scars not from plows or rain but from spears and boots and flames, and there I felt at the ache, not of waiting but of wounding, not the hush of hope but the quiet that follows weeping too long, the kind that sinks into the soil and refuses to rise again. I have danced above battlefields where no one sings, circled craters where fires once burned bright with hatred, and brushed against bones, bleached by time and by forgetfulness. And in these places the air is thick, not with dust, but with memory. Memory too heavy to name. I remember the cries, not of warriors but of mothers, of children pulled from their homes, of fathers who ran without shoes into darkness that did not end, and though their voices are gone, I hear them still, embedded in the stones, etched into the bark of trees that managed to survive the flames, and when I pass over them, I do not howl as I do in open desert. I whisper, I mourn, I slow myself to listen. There is something sacred in the sorrow of a land, something that no victory can erase, and though men forget, I do not. I remember the day the blood ran thicker than water through the streets of a city once called holy, how the gates were broken and the temple burned, how the sky turned dark, not with clouds but with smoke and cries, and I circled above it all, helpless, useless, but present, always present, carrying ashes farther than they wished to go. I remember the faces of children hidden behind rubble, not understanding the price of kings' ambitions, only knowing that silence had replaced songs, that bread no longer came, that prayers were shorter and sharper and more desperate than before. And I carried their cries. I carried them into the night, into the hills, into the windless corners of the world, because someone had to, because the heavens did not answer. Not then, not yet. I remember the exile, the long trail of feet dragging through foreign soil, heads bowed not only in submission but in disbelief, that the covenant had not protected them, that the ark no longer meant safety, that the word had not intervened, and still, even then, I heard them sing. Not loudly, not joyfully, but stubbornly, as if to sing was to survive, as if to remember was to resist, and I wove through those songs like thread through fabric, fragile and necessary. I have followed the scattered people across oceans of sand and centuries of silence, and each time war returned. Each time injustice wore a new face. I returned too, not as a comfort, but as a witness. I passed through prison gates and execution hills, through marketplaces where dignity was bought and sold, through homes torn apart not by storms but by soldiers, and everywhere I went, the ground spoke, not in words, but in weight. There is a heaviness to blood spilled unjustly, a temperature the earth remembers, and I felt it rising from the soil like steam, unseen but undeniable. I felt it beneath the olive groves where sons did not return, and beneath the walls of towns now renamed, and in the corners of tombs dug too early, and I wondered how long, O Lord, how long must this land weep without reply? How long will injustice remain unanswered, evil unchecked, sorrow unhealed? And I, who have no voice, began to cry, not with sound, but with presence. I swept through the ruins not to erase, but to remind. I circled over the bloodied stones not to cleanse, but to honor, because somewhere, beneath all this pain, a promise still waits. Somewhere, in all this loss, there is still the echo of redemption. Not yet, not now, but coming, and I must believe that. Because if I, who have seen so much death, stop believing in the possibility of life, then what am I but a wind without purpose, a breath without direction? And so I continue, carrying the weight, remembering the names, stirring the dust of the fallen, not with despair, but with the stubborn hope that one day, the one will come who gathers every tear, who hears every cry, who walks not with armies but with healing, not with thunder but with mercy, and on that day, even the blood-soaked ground will sing. There are nights when I move softly, not because the world is at peace, but because something delicate still breathes in the hush, something I dare not disturb with sudden gusts or wandering noise. And it is in those hours between sleep and dawn that I find myself drawn to the smallest plaza courtyards where olive trees whisper to the moon, alleys where oil lamps tremble against cold stone, homes where the walls are cracked but still shelter warmth, and in these quiet corners I discover a kind of remembrance too fragile to be called tradition, too fierce to be forgotten. I pass through rooms where mothers sit beside cradles, rocking not only their children but also the long ache of their ancestors. Their lullabies carrying more than melody, they carry memory, not the memory of fact, but of longing, of hope folded into rhythm, of promises that seep into the skin through sound. I drift near them, letting their voices pass through me, letting the syllables swirl inside me. And though I cannot sing, I hold the songs. I carry them farther than any echo, letting them settle in the eaves of distant homes, on the shoulders of women who do not know each other but hum the same tune because their grandmothers did, and their grandmothers before them. The words change from village to village, but the heart does not. Always there is a yearning, a reaching towards something more than bread and roof, and rest, a hunger for healing, for wholeness, for the return of the voice that once spoke through flames and parted waters. I have listened to children whisper tales by firelight, tales they half believe, stories handed down like garments too large for them, stories of seas splitting, of manna falling, of angels appearing in desert places. And though their eyes are sleepy and their questions many, I hear in their wonder the soil where faith still tries to grow. They speak the name of Moses with awe, not understanding fully who he was, only that he talked with God, and they speak of Elijah with fear and delight, imagining chariots of fire not as history but as maybe. And I, who knew these men, who wrapped around them in their most lonely hours, find myself moved not by the accuracy of the story but by the persistence of its telling. Even when the fire has gone out, the warmth lingers, and it lingers in these stories told under stars, in rooms too small for books, too poor for scrolls, but rich with breath and voice and listening. I pass into synagogues where teachers still recite ancient words to boys too young to understand them fully, and I watch as those syllables fall into the room like seedsome bouncing away, some settling in, all of them alive with potential. I know the words. I have heard them in palaces and deserts, in caves and on battlefields, and though their cadence changes, their core remains: the Lord remembers, the Lord sees, the Lord will act. I have traced these truths through centuries, and I have seen how easily they are bruised but not broken, bent but not lost. Even when silence reigns, even when prophecy ceases, these words remain in the mouths of those who refuse to let them die. And in the hands of storytellers, the promise becomes personal, not a doctrine but a heartbeat, not a prophecy but a possibility. I move through these voices as though through incense, curling and clinging, light but lingering, and I find myself strangely humbled by their persistence. No trumpet calls them to speak, no fire descends to confirm their faith, and yet they speak, they sing, they tell. And in that telling, something divine stirs, something holy waits. I have felt it in the pause before a mother's final note, in the silence after a child's question, in the quiet nod of a father who listens from the doorway, not interrupting, not correcting, but letting the story stand, letting it be what it must, a bridge between what was and what might be. And I wonder, as I pass from house to house, whether the Word himself listens, whether he leans closer as I do, whether he feels, as I feel, that these fragile songs and fractured tales are preparing something, clearing a path, softening the soil for his return. Perhaps he walks already, unseen, not far from the sound of their voices. Perhaps he waits, not in the thunder, but in the whisper. And if so, then these mothers, these children, these storytellers by firelight, they are the prophets now, and their songs, the new psalms. And I, old as I am, restless as ever, am honored to carry them. I remember the fire that didn't burn, the chariot that had no wheels, the day the sky opened in silence and carried the prophet away in a whirlwind that even I could not keep up with. And I remember how the earth held its breath as Elijah rose, how even the stones seemed to mourn not his death, for there was none, but his departure, his leaving without warning, without farewell, only a flash of flame and the weightless fall of a mantle. And I, the wind that once danced around his feet, that whispered to him on Mount Horeb, that carried the scent of bread and water to his cave. I stayed still that day, unsure whether to rise with him or remain with the ones left behind. Elisha caught the mantle, yes, but not the fullness of the fire, not the trembling wonder that once followed Elijah's every word. And though he parted the waters, though miracles followed him, something had shifted, some chapter had closed. And I felt it in the way the air no longer buzzed with anticipation but with the long echo of memory. I remember Daniel and the lions, not as children remember it with toothless beasts and a gentle old man praying in the dark, but as it truly was, a night soaked in tension, a stone rolled into place with more finality than a tomb, the breath of the lions heavy and real and hot, and Daniel standing not in defiance but in surrender, not hoping to be saved, but determined to remain faithful even if he wasn't. I was there, circling in the unseen space above the beasts, brushing against their fur, waiting for the moment they would lunge, and they never did. The silence in that den was thick, holy, alive with a presence no eye could see. And when morning came, when the king ran and called out in dread and hope, I rushed from the den ahead of Daniel's answer, for I had already heard it in his stillness. I remembered Job, scraped and broken, seated in ash with words that dared accuse and dared believe at once, and I danced between the arguments of his friends, scattering their half-truths and empty platitudes, for they spoke to defend a God they did not understand, while Job, in his agony, still sought the face he could not see. He was not rebuked for his pain, no, only for imagining that his understanding could hold the mystery. And when the whirlwind camenote me, something more I withdrew, reverent and awed, for I had never heard that voice speak like that, not to condemn, but to call into humility, into trust, into awe. And I remember how Job, though he was never given the answer he wanted, was given something deeper, the presence itself, unfiltered, undeniable. I remember the exile, the dragging of feet through dust, the tearing of garments, the weeping by rivers, not their own, and I moved among them not to comfort but to carry, to lift the cries that rose from throats too dry for song. And even there, even among foreign gods and stolen names, they whispered the psalms, not aloud, but in memory, and I held those words. I kept them from fading. I let them rest in the folds of my being like seeds in the wind. I remember the dreams of Pharaoh interpreted by a prisoner who still bore the scent of betrayal. I remember the courage of Esther in the palace, the desperation of Jonah beneath the sun-scorched vine, the resilience of Ruth gleaning in foreign fields, and I remember how none of them heard a voice from the sky, and yet each of them chose, risked, believed, waited. The silence now is no greater than theirs, only longer, only heavier. And I, who have flown through all these centuries, who have whispered through every page, I ask myself again, is silence truly silence when it carries the weight of so much waiting? Or is it a deeper speech, the kind that precedes revelation the way stillness precedes a storm or labor precedes birth? The stories they tell are not just echoes of glory, they are clues, reminders that God is not absent even when unseen, that his ways are not always fire and flood but often the slow turning of history, the hidden weaving of generations, the deep ache of promises that take root before they bloom. I pass now through towns that speak of him only in ritual, through synagogues where the scrolls are read with reverence but little expectation, and I wonder, do they know what I know? Do they feel it in their bones, the way I do in the air, that something is moving beneath the surface, quiet, slow, unstoppable? I feel it like pressure before the rain, like the tension in the chest before a long-awaited letter is opened. And though no prophets thunder, though the stars do not fall, I believe, not because I see, but because I remember, because the same hush I felt before the fire took Elijah, before the stone was rolled from the lion's den, before the whirlwind answered Job, I feel now. And I wait, not because I am idle, but because the silence is holy, and I will not miss the moment it breaks. There is a room the world has forgotten, a chamber buried behind layers of dust and disuse, tucked beneath a building that no longer rings with laughter or lament. A room with no windows, no voices, no breath but mine. And yet I return to it again and again, not because it welcomes me, but because it remembers something that no one else does. Because it contains more than silence, it contains what silence protects. The walls are lined with shelves that sag under the weight of parchment and leather, cracked scrolls that curl like sleeping animals, too brittle to unfold without breaking, and I drift among them gently, not as a thief, but as a guardian, moving past each scroll with the reverence of one who knows that even the most fragile ink can hold eternity. These are not the scrolls read at festivals or recited in public squares. These are the forgotten ones, the ones too damaged to repair, too sacred to discard, the ones that carry names no one speaks and promises too long delayed to stir excitement. And yet they stir me. I pass over them, and I feel something risen, not wind, not voice, but memory. Like heat from long-cooled ash, like a whisper buried in time. I have watched men handle these scrolls with gloves and fear, afraid of what they might find or fail to understand. And I have seen others walk past them entirely, choosing the louder texts, the more immediate wisdoms, as if urgency were the same as truth. But I know better. I know that the scroll with the torn edge and faded ink still bears the words of Habakkuk crying out for justice, still holds the vision of Obadiah about the fall of Edom, still whispers Micah's lament for a people who have forgotten how to walk humbly. I remember when those words were first spoken, how they cracked the air like dry branches, how they filled the valleys with warning and promise alike, and now they sit in silence, not because they are empty, but because the world has grown deaf. Still I listen, still I carry. I remember the day a scribe set down his reed, not out of fatigue but awe, having copied the final verse of a prophecy he did not fully understand. And I remember how his hands trembled, not because he feared punishment, but because he knew the words he had just written would outlive him, would outlive kings and temples and perhaps even memory. He tied the scroll and sealed it with care, and though his name is lost, his faith remains, pressed into every letter, waiting like a seed in winter. I have traced these scrolls through generations, followed their movements from hand to hand, from city to city, from exile to return, and I have seen how the ink fades but the meaning holds, how the words sleep but do not die. I once watched a child unroll a scroll too large for his arms, his fingers smudging the edge of a verse from Isaiah, and though he could not read it, he hummed as he touched it, a tune passed from his mother, who had no parchment, only song. And I wrapped around them both, carrying that melody into the crevices of this room, where it still lingers. There are scrolls here that speak of a servant wounded for our transgressions, of a voice crying in the wilderness, of a stone rejected by builders. And I know what these mean, though no one dares to say it aloud. They are not history, they are prophecy. They are the blueprint of a redemption not yet revealed. And though the scribes have died, though the temples have fallen, though the nations have risen and collapsed in turn, the scrolls remain. They remain because the word once spoken cannot be unsaid. They remain because the breath of God does not return void. They remain because someone will need them still. I fly above these texts like a watchman, listening for the first ripple of recognition, the first stirring in the hearts of those who will dare to unroll them again, to read not with the eyes of scholars, but with the ache of those who have waited too long. I whisper through the cracks in this room, letting the dust shift just enough to remind the faithful that something here waits, that something here lives. These scrolls are not dead relics, they are witnesses. They have seen too much to be discarded, known too much to be dismissed, and when the time comes, when the fullness of time breaks through the silence, it will be from these pages that the memory returns, that the name is recognized, that the mystery is made plain. I do not know when that will be. I only know that the scrolls are ready, that the room, though abandoned, still breathes with a holy expectancy, and I, the wind that has borne these words from prophet to parchment, will be there when they are unsealed again. For in them is written not only what was, but what will be, and that is a weight I am honored to carry. There are seasons when even I hesitate to move, not because I am weary, but because I sense that something beneath the surface of time has begun to tremble in a way I cannot name, as if history itself were holding its breath. And though I have passed through centuries of longing and have brushed the shoulders of prophets and kings, though I have lingered in temples and flown through tombs, there is a kind of stillness now, a kind of quiet expectancy that feels heavier than any storm I have carried. And in that stillness, I begin to notice certain souls, not loud ones, not leaders or warriors or scribes with followers and fame, but quiet ones, old ones, small and often unseen, who walk as if listening to a voice no one else hears, who pray not to change the world, but to remain faithful in the waiting. I first saw him seated in the temple courtyard, his back slightly bent, his eyes watching the horizon, though the city stood between him and the edge of the sky. and I knew him before I knew his name, because he carried in his stillness the same tension I had carried for centuries, yearning wrapped in obedience, a patience sharpened by love. Simeon. That was the name they called him, but I knew him as the one who listened, even when heaven was silent. Day after day he came, not demanding, not despairing, simply arriving, as if faith had become muscle memory, as if the promise he had heard long ago had woven itself so deeply into him that he could no longer distinguish between longing and living. I watched as others passed him by, merchants, with full hands and anxious eyes, priests moving swiftly from one ritual to the next, travelers too weary to look up, but he remained, eyes lifted, as if expecting something impossible, and I wondered what kept him here, what unseen thread tied him to this place. And then I saw her, Anna. Her steps were smaller, her years heavier, her prayers quieter than most breaths, but her presence carried a fire that had not gone out despite the long ache of widowhood and solitude. She lived here now, not as a guest but as part of the very stones, her life poured out drop by drop in fasting, in praise, in waiting. I moved past her once as she prayed, and I felt it not the usual rise of words into the air, but something deeper, a current of trust so unwavering it made even my ancient path still for a moment. These two, Simeon and Anna, spoke little, but they listened much, and what they heard was not sound but movement, not prophecy but pulse, and I, who have known every kind of voice, recognized theirs as the kind that heaven trusts. They did not know when, they did not know how, but they knew he was coming. Not because the scrolls told them when, but because something in their bones had begun to ring like bells no one else could hear. I began to watch them more closely, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence, for they reminded me that waiting is not wasted when it is anchored in trust. Simeon would sometimes whisper fragments of psalms beneath his breath, not to impress, not even to remember, but as if aligning his soul with a rhythm deeper than time, and when he said, "My eyes shall see your salvation," I felt a tremor pass through the air as if the future had agreed. Anna would press her hand against the wall of the temple and close her eyes, not to see visions, but to hold steady the promise that had kept her breathing for decades. And though her fingers were frail, her spirit struck me with the weight of 1,000 thunders. These were not remnants of a fading age. They were forerunners, the ones who wait so long they become the threshold between silence and song. And so I, who had flown restless across deserts and seas, who had searched every cave and scroll and prayer for signs of his coming, I began to stay close, no longer chasing storms or following shouts, but hovering near these quiet ones whose hearts had become altars. And then, one day, the air changed, not with wind or trumpet or fire, but with the faintest shift, like a door opening in a far room, like the first breath of dawn before the sky changes color. It came not with spectacle but with certainty. I followed Simeon's gaze as it fell upon a poor couple carrying a child wrapped in nothing special, walking as all poor couples walk, cautious, tired, unnoticed. But Simeon rose. Anna turned. I felt it in the air. The promise had arrived, not with banners or blades, but as a child carried in human arms, as fragile as morning light. And yet I, who have swept through kingdoms and over blood-stained fields, knew in that instant that the wind would never be the same. Simeon took the child and sang, not as a priest, not as a prophet, but as a man who had waited long enough to recognize glory in the ordinary. His song was not loud, but it filled me, filled the whole space with something I cannot name but still feel. "Now you may dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation." These words were not declaration, they were release. His waiting was complete, and Anna, who had waited even longer, began to speak not to crowds, but to the few who still hoped, telling them not to despair, not to give up, not to assume that silence means absence, because the child had come, because the promise had entered the world, not with conquest, but with presence. I swept around them both, not as a gale, not as spectacle, but as a witness. I wanted to linger, to stay beside this family, to follow them wherever they went, but something in me knew that my place was still in the margins, still in the watching. The moment had come, but the journey had only begun, and so I returned to the edges, to the roads, to the windless corners where the world still waited unknowingly, and I carried with me the breath of that day, the scent of the temple stones, the salt of tears on Anna's cheeks, the warmth of a child's breath against Simeon's hands. I carried it not because I understood, but because I believed. Because after all this time, after all the silence and sorrow, the promise had not been forgotten. It had only been growing quiet, hidden, alive. Something shifted that night, though no one noticed at first. Not the way they notice storms or eclipses or the fall of cities. No, it came like the hush before dawn, like a pause between heartbeats, like a breath drawn deep before a name is spoken for the very first time. And I, who have danced through centuries and tasted the fires of Sinai and the tears of Babylon, I felt it before I saw it. Not in the sky, but in the stillness of the earth, as if the soil itself had been holding its breath for far too long. I had passed over this village 1,000 times before, a place too small for maps, too poor for history, its roads etched not in stone but in dust, its people bent more by labor than by pride, and I never lingered, not because it was empty, but because nothing ever changed. Nothing ever called to me the way cities did, or mountains did, or temples once did. But that night was different, not because the stars shone brighter, but because the silence had changed. It was no longer empty, it was expectant. I slipped through alleyways lined with sleeping goats and shuttered doors, past hearths still warm with the memory of evening meals, past windows covered not by glass but by woven cloth, and then I felt it, not wind, not light, but presence. There was no fire, no trumpet, no angel with a flaming sword, only breath, uneven and new, and I followed it the way I have always followed what is sacred, not by force, but by draw, by pull, by the whisper of something eternal, hiding in the mortal. I found them in a stable, if one could call it that, more cave than building, its stones blackened by time, its air thick with the scent of animals and straw and damp earth, and in the corner, on a pile of hay not fit for feeding, a woman lay still, her face pale with fatigue, her eyes wide, not with fear but with wonder, and in her arms, he. I did not know what I expected. After all the centuries of waiting, the scrolls, the prophecies, the cries for justice and signs and vengeance and glory, after all the thunder and whispers and visions of kings riding clouds, this was how he arrived, not robed in fire but swaddled in cloth, not with a scepter but with clenched fists too small to hold anything but air. I moved closer, slowly, as if afraid to disturb something too holy to name. And when I reached the edge of the manger, I stopped not because I was forbidden, but because I was overwhelmed. The one I had waited for, the one every prophet had dreamed of, the one whose name had burned in the bones of saints and martyrs and mothers, was here, not beyond reach, not behind veil or altar or cloud, but here, held in human arms, breathing mortal air. And I, the wind, who had once carried the breath of God across the waters of creation, now watched as that same breath trembled in a newborn chest. I cannot describe what I felt. Awe is too small, fear is too shallow, joy is too loud. It was silence that spoke then, the kind of silence that wraps around a soul like a garment, the kind that doesn't shout or echo but lingers, seeps, lives. His eyes opened once, and though they did not yet focus, though they saw nothing, I felt seen, not as the restless wind that never stops moving, but as something named, something known. Around us the animals stirred, the stars hung heavy, the woman exhaled a prayer too quiet for language, and I, who had never stopped moving, stayed, for hours, for lifetimes, for as long as the breath of that child rose and fell. I do not know what he understood then. I do not know if he felt the ache of the world he had entered, the weight of the promise he had become, the sorrow he had come to bear. But I know what I felt. I felt the end of waiting, not the end of suffering, not yet, not by far, but the end of that long, aching silence that had stretched between heaven and earth like a wound no word could cross. And it was not thunder that ended it. It was breath. It was skin. It was the heartbeat of a child born not into royalty but into need, into fragility, into straw. That night, shepherds came, wild-eyed and breathless. their faces still lit with the glow of something unexplainable, and they knelt not because they understood, but because they couldn't help it. They told of voices in the sky, of songs too large for their ears, of angels who had spoken of peace and glory, and something called good news. And I knew then that I had heard that music before, in fragments, in echoes, and now, here it was, fulfilled in the hum of a newborn sleeping. I wanted to speak, but I had no voice. I wanted to praise, but I had no song. And so I did what I do best. I carried the warmth of that stable, the scent of that hay, the sound of that breath, out into the world. I moved across fields and rivers, through the halls of palaces and the corners of forgotten streets, stirring the souls of those who had stopped hoping, waking the dreams of those who had settled for silence, and I whispered not with answers, but with presence. I whispered that the time had come, that the word had become flesh, that the silence had broken, not with thunder, but with a cry. And though many did not hear me, though many still do not, I know what I know. He is here, and nothing will ever be the same. I have wandered longer than any river, longer than any beast or man or king, and for most of my days I believed I would never arrive, never find the end of my restlessness, because wind is made to move, to sweep, to scatter and never stay. And yet something has changed, something so quiet that if I were not the wind I might have missed it, but I didn't, because when you've spent your life chasing voices, you recognize when one finally answers, even if the answer comes not in thunder or flame, but in the trembling cry of a child who has just entered the world through blood and breath and silence. I still remember the desert, its heat, its fury, its barren expanse where nothing grows except longing, and I remember how I used to scream across it, my howls the only sound between earth and sky, and I thought then that I existed only to stir dust, to test the patience of nomads and scatter the tents of prophets, to be the breath of the forsaken. I carried fire once, I shook mountains, I curled around the edges of burning bushes and tried to taste the voice that came from within, but it was never mine, only passing through me, always beyond me, and so I kept moving, through exodus and exile, through psalms and plagues, through silence and song. I remember how I used to linger near the temple, how I brushed against the curtains of the Holy of Holies and wondered what it might feel like to be more than a witness, to not just carry the scent of incense, but to be drawn in, to be seen, to be welcomed. But the temple is cold now, its courts quiet, its fire reduced to ritual, and still I searched. I went to the hills where shepherds sleep and to the towers where priests keep watch. I whispered through the dreams of carpenters and stirred the pots of widows, and all the while something grew inside me, not noise, but hunger, not direction, but ache. Then he came, not in majesty, but in flesh, not in fury, but in fragility. I saw him with my own breath, and everything I thought I knew about presence and power shifted, because I had always thought that God would arrive the way I do with force, with movement, with sound, but he came with none of these. He came still, he came small, and when I passed over him that night, I felt something I have never felt before: resistance, not in anger, not in denial, but in fullness. He did not push me away, but neither did he need me to announce him. He was not drawn along by the wind like the rest of creation. He had weight, not the weight of sin or sorrow, not yet, but the weight of intention, of incarnation. He was not carried, he had come. I stayed close, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I watched how he clung to his mother's skin, how his tiny chest rose and fell without effort, how the animals quieted around him not from fear but from recognition, as if they too had been waiting, as if even the beasts knew that something ancient had returned to the world in a new form. I saw how Joseph looked at him, eyes wide with responsibility and awe, unsure of how to hold the holy. And I watched Mary, exhausted and radiant, the way only one who has suffered to bring forth life can be. And I thought, this is how the world begins again, not with fire or flood, but with a breath. I carried that breath as far as I could. I moved through Jerusalem and Nazareth, through fields and forests and lakeside towns, and everywhere I went I whispered, not loudly, not to demand attention, but gently, like a secret longing to be heard. Some heard, most didn't. That's how it has always been. But it didn't matter, because I was no longer just the wind. I had become a witness. I had touched eternity wrapped in swaddling clothes. I had hovered over the one who once hovered over the waters. I had passed through every age longing for this moment, and now it was here. And though the world would take years, decades, centuries to understand it, I understood. I understood not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. The silence had ended. The waiting had turned. The word had been spoken again, not in stone or scroll, but in skin. I still move, of course. That is my nature. But I no longer search in the same way. I no longer ache with the same emptiness, because he is here, because he walked where I have wandered, because he breathed the same air I carry. And though the world will still break, and the cities will still fall, and the hearts of men will still tremble in the dark, there will always be this truth. I was there when the breath of heaven entered the world. I felt it, I carry it, and I will never be the same.